Um, Good morning, everyone. We haven't started yet, so I'm gonna wait till 7 o'clock and then officially start talking. But for now, good morning. This is very weird. I'm not used to live streaming. I need to work out how to look up here somewhere instead of directly at my own face. And once I get used to that, I'm sure it'll be much more enjoyable for everyone who is watching at home. This is really weird. But yeah, I'm just going to sit here. It's 3 to 7 in the morning in Australia, and I haven't woken up at that time for a while, apparently, because I didn't realize that it'd still be dark. And so there are a lot of lamps in this room because there's the light blue. So I'm just surrounded by lamps. It's kind of light now, but it wasn't like 10 minutes ago. Hi, Martin, in the comments. This is actually quite fun. Like weird but fun. Yeah, all right. Thanks, Helen. Yeah, when everyone was making fake Zoom backgrounds, I'm like, but I love my office. It's my favorite room in the house. Yeah, those posters are from like, oh, what's it called? The fake, in yeah, it needs more Australian paraphernalia. The posters are from the what's the like fake time travel thing that McSweeney's people run, the time travel mart. And so they're fake posters from the past and the future, which I really like, that we got when we were at Work in LA on a trip to LA to go to Work It. Yeah, it does need more. I do wish it was just Australiana behind me, because that feels like it'd be leaning into it a bit. I almost put there's normally like a lot of trash on this mantelpiece, but I cleared it for you guys because I'm really classy like that. I just swiped it off and put it somewhere. And then later I'll probably put it back, maybe, or maybe it'll live in a box in my room until the next live stream. There's also like herbs drying. That's not, I haven't killed someone. That's, yeah, Gear came in and was like, it looks like you're doing something really witchy, which I guess seed saving is a little bit witchy, but that's all I'm doing, is things hanging from the mantle there. Yeah, it could. I mean, Helen says that the mantelpiece totally has room for a couple of penis owls, which is a highlight of Australian tourism. They don't make sort of miniature penis owls, I don't think. I haven't been able to find them, but they, they should. I'd buy one. Maybe I wouldn't buy one because just looks like a penis. It's an owl, everyone, that looks like a penis if you're watching this back later. But yeah, they don't make small ones out of like marble to take home like they do Parliament House or something. They should. I think I'd be able to talk about Canberra more enthusiastically if they did make penis owl that you could have sitting on your mantelpiece at home and people go, what's that? And you go, it's the penis owl, go to Canberra. I'm not making my own, Martin. Martin says, make my own penis owl statue. And I think if I tried, I don't think I could get the owl in there. Like, it's real art to be able to make something that looks like both a penis and an owl. So it's going to be one or the other. I'm gonna either make a penis or an owl. It's not going to be both. All right, it's 7 o'clock. Maybe I should. A microphone in the shape of an owl. I can't make a penis, microphone, owl. That's 3 things, and I can't even manage one. So, yeah, I think we won't be doing that. Maybe I should get started for reals instead of just talking about dicks and birds, potentially. All right. Morning, everyone. I'm actually, contrary to what you might think if you just started watching, morning, Olivia. I'm not doing a live stream on the penis owl in Canberra or any other Australian tourist attraction or not attraction. I'm going to be talking for the next hour about the good afternoon, Chris. Oh, Chris, hi. I thought Ella was calling Olivia Chris because I totally missed Chris. Morning. Oh my God, there's people all around the world. This is weird. Okay, I'm going to have to I'm going to have to stop talking about phallic birds and start talking about podcasting. This is exciting. All right. So I'm going to be talking about Australian and New Zealand podcasts, and I'm trying to talk about some that are recent. So otherwise there was just too many to choose from. So I haven't gone back into the depths of Australian audio history for today's different podcasts. We could be interrupted by my cat. So if you can hear meowing, she's locked outside so that she doesn't interrupt this live stream, because otherwise she would stomp all over my keyboard. But she'll get bored and leave. That's what the meowing is. It's not a sound effect that I'm playing. It's a real cat. That's really sad. But yeah, so I've tried to pick recent podcasts, and because you're all also podcast makers, and I'm a podcast maker, not a podcast critic, I've kind of tried to focus on the different things that I've learned from these podcasts that I can apply to my own podcast making and that have made me a better producer for listening to them, I suppose, in the last year or so. I've gone a little bit outside of the year, but the last approximately year. And a lot of them I've come across. So my job is I'm the festival manager for Audiocraft, which is a podcast festival in Australia. And to program that festival, I listen to heaps and heaps of podcasts. And people send us in different podcasts and different ideas for the festival. And also, we're just constantly listening to any Australian podcast that we can get our hands on. And so there's some really amazing stuff out there, and stuff that I've listened to in the last little while that I'm very excited to talk about today. I guess maybe I'll kind of get started. I'm going to try and share my screen, which okay, share screen. This one. So I'm going to share, no, that's huge. Here we are. I'm going to share the podcast tiles up next to me. There they are, just there, so that you can find the podcast yourself later, and have a listen to all of it. I'm also going to attempt to play you some of the audio, but we'll see if that works or not. So I might just talk about the podcasts a little bit first, just in case the audio thing doesn't work. So the first podcast that I wanted to tell you guys about today is called Bird's Eye View. It's a podcast made by women at the Darwin Correctional Centre. Darwin's up in the north of Australia. And it's an incredible project. It took years and years for them to put it together. Johanna Bell, who runs the production company Story Projects, has been working on this for years. And the thing that I've learned a lot about from listening to this podcast, and I suppose hearing about how it was made as well, is like what it means to have a true collaboration. So like they really wanted to have a podcast where they worked hand in hand with the people who, I suppose, like 10 years ago or something, we might have thought of as the subjects of the podcast or the subjects of the radio documentary. So the women who are in this prison, there's been documentary projects inside prisons before. And I think that what they've done really well is like handed over the creation project process, like in a really big way, to the women who are in the correctional centre in prison, and the different iterations of how they made it, like how the different drafts it went through, and sort of the different ways that the women had to say, not just in what the podcast was about or the format or the stories that they were telling, but also in the edits, and having different edit rounds was really cool. And I think you can really hear it as well. It doesn't sound like it doesn't sound like it's someone coming from outside and deciding what the story of these women would be. It sounds like it's come from them and from inside. And at the same time, it's really glorious use of audio. Like it's beautiful and fun, and sort of sprinkled through with different like fake ads for different things in the prison, different sound effects that are really drawn from the world that they're living in, so different birds and sounds of inside the prison. And yeah, I really recommend that you give it a listen, especially if you're watching this from outside Australia. It's one that I think you should give a go. I think also something that they do that's really cool is they collaborated with a bunch of musicians from Darwin, so women from the Northern Territory and from Darwin, and worked that music in. And I think that that's like something that it takes a lot of effort to do, and must have been, yeah, really, really hard, because of how licensing works in Australia and around the world, but also, yeah, just sort of trying to find those pieces that work, and then working with the musicians. Cinnamon Napard, who is part of the Audiocraft agency, she worked on this podcast as well, and I've heard from her that was like a real process, but a really sort of cool, worthwhile one. You can hear that it comes through as well. It just sounds like it comes from Darwin, which is yeah, really awesome, I think. But the main thing I've learned from this one, and the main thing that I'm interested in the making of this podcast, is thinking about collaboration and what it means. So letting people in, finding ways to have sort of true feedback and true room for change at like multiple points in the edit process. And it took them like 3 years to get this season out. I think 3 years. I'm thinking about like back at Audiocraft, yeah, 3 Audiocrafts ago, Yo was there with this idea that was just starting out. So when it is a true collaboration, that's how long it takes, I suppose, is the other lesson. And something that I think makes it a really brilliant podcast. It's one of the best things I've heard this year. So yeah, give that a listen. All right, I'm going to try and flick to the next one. Let's try. Here we are. Okay, so the next one I want to talk about is a fiction podcast from SYN Media's podcast incubator. So it's called The Graduate's Cup, as you can see. I did it right. I'm pointing the opposite direction that I feel like I should be. And it's a fiction podcast. So SYN is a community radio station in Melbourne, and you have to be under 25 to be part of SYN. So when you turn 25, you SYN die, which is a really harsh way to turn 25. Let me tell you, you'd be like, you're too old now, bye. But it does mean that they have some really cool, they sort of, a lot of the people there are learning to make radio while they're making radio. And it just means that a lot of the stuff they put out is fantastic, because they've learned the technical skills yet, but they maybe haven't learned all the rules of how you're meant to use them. And it just means that, yeah, that the stuff that they make often breaks a lot of rules, and they don't even know it. They don't even realize it. And it makes for really awesome podcasts. But this program in particular, the podcast incubator, they were mentored and sort of trained by lots of different podcasters and people in the industry. And so the credits on all the podcasts that are out of the incubator have some really brilliant names in them. People doing script editing and feedback. And so I think that like they gave a lot of support to these people who maybe hadn't made an audio fiction before. And yeah, the outcome is brilliant. I really love these shows. So this is just one of them. There's others as well. There's BS Cryptid. There's some nonfiction. So they're just the 2 of the fiction podcasts that came out of it. But the reason I wanted to talk about Graduate's Cup is it does something really clever. Like, there's a technique I've actually been thinking a lot about since listening to this podcast. So the plot is that there's the East Keilor soccer team, football team, I suppose, England. So the students of East Keilor High School are basically having a trial to allow girls to play in the top male soccer league, football league. And so it's all about, okay, I guess the background here is that sort of women's sport in Melbourne in particular, but in Australia has been something that has been like, I guess, like front of mind issue, because the AFL, so our Australia, I don't even know how to talk about sport for an international audience. None of these terms make sense, but the AFL has a women's league that's actually like doing really well, and is, you know, drawing audiences, and that's a new thing, sort of a new thing here. So yeah, I suppose that puts women's sport front of mind, and this kind of didn't come directly out of that. I'm sure it came out of soccer-specific things that I don't understand as well. But that's the lens that I was listening to it through, sort of that tension between women's sport and men's sport, and who's allowed to play in what. And something that so there's sort of a in the first few episodes of this fiction podcast, there's an upstart women's team, and one of the main players is really, really good, and she's kind of fighting for the right to be able to play football. And but the thing that they use, the technique that I've been thinking about since I listened to this sort of at the end of last year, is the unreliable narrator in podcasts, and in fiction and in nonfiction. And I think that sometimes when we're trying to like tell a story, our narrator can wind up not being unreliable. They just don't know any, or that you feel a bit tricked or something like that. It's not that you've played with the technique of an unreliable narrator. It's that you want the audience to only know something at a certain time, so you've withheld your sort of an unreliable production system instead of an unreliable narrator with a real purpose. And I think that what this podcast does really well is that at the end of episode 2, and I don't want to spoil anything, so I'm going to try and like hold back a little bit, but at the end of episode 2, there's a real moment where they're playing with the fact that that the audience knows something. Something's dawning on the audience before it's dawning on the narrator themselves, and that's, yeah, it's really fun. And so things are unfolding, and you're getting part of what's happening, but you're not getting quite enough to you're not getting quite enough to give it away. And I think it's a real fine line. Like if you take it too far the other way, sometimes you just think you don't respect the narrator and you're like, oh, you're really not smart. So you don't want the audience to be too far ahead of the narrator, but there's something so satisfying about watching a show or listening to something and you feel clever because they're not quite there yet and you are. And it's, maybe you have like a little bit more information than they do, or your perspective in the audio is a little bit broader than what theirs is. And yeah, I think that they walk that line in this podcast in a way that feels really satisfying. The music also helps at that point in the story. Like when you listen to it, there's this sort of there's tension rising music that's happening underneath, and maybe that's why we're ahead of the narrator, right? Is because they're like cluing us in, like something's not right here, and the narrator doesn't have that track that's going on at the same time. But yeah, I think it's a great show. It's got a big cast for a community radio fiction show. Like it has a lot of people speaking in it, and there's like the girls soccer team, the boys soccer team, and the coach, and all these different parts of the plot. And I think it's quite a complex story, and they've done it really well. So that's one that I would really recommend you check out. So the next one I'm going to talk about is, I guess I want to do a content warning. I'm not going to play the audio, but before I talk about it, it's about the Christchurch attack. And so, yeah, when I was going to play audio, I really wanted to let you guys know that before I changed slides, just because it is like quite an upsetting, like a lot of the podcast is really upsetting, but it's done really well. And I think that, if that's something that you're happy to listen to, then you should go and listen to this podcast. But I'm going to change slides. So this is a Radio New Zealand. Oh, all the slides are different sizes. I didn't mean to do that. That's not, this is like, now there's a big black box that I can like eat my head up with. So this is a podcast out of Radio New Zealand, who are doing really cool stuff at the moment, the public broadcaster in New Zealand. And this one's called Widows of Shahada. And it basically, it follows four women in the year following the Christchurch attack. So the year ended in March this year, and the fact that Australia's coronavirus lockdown started, and I think New Zealand started around that time too. It was kind of like the week that everything changed here in a really big way was the week that the Year On coverage and this Year On podcast, which is really wonderful, came out. And so I think that it's one that got a bit lost in the everything that happened, and having listened to it, it's amazing. Like it, going back to what Bird's Eye View did, it's a long-term collaboration. So it's something that they spent a lot of time working on, the relationships that go into making this story. And I think that you can really hear the way that they spent that time. So it started out, it was a Christchurch community radio station, Plains FM, was doing a radio show in the immediate aftermath of Christchurch. And they were focusing on sort of the impact that it had, and sort of different things that people were doing to move forward with their lives, and also reflecting on it from different perspectives, different coping mechanisms people had, different, like interrogating different things about the aftermath of that attack. And so out of that grew this decision to focus on widows in particular. And then they worked with Radio New Zealand to put together this podcast. And yeah, it's a really intimate look at the lives of these women and their attitudes towards what happened to their husbands. It's hosted by a Muslim broadcasting student, Asha Abdi, and the Al Noor Mosque's women's coordinator, Jemiah Jones, and produced by someone from Plains FM, Lana Hart, with producers at Radio New Zealand as well. And so it is like this really mammoth collaboration, and something like reading about how they made it. They said there was this moment where they brought together the 4 women who were participants who were sort of telling their story, the people who are in the podcast. They brought them together for the first time, and one of them hadn't spoken about her experience yet, and just the act of all of them being in the room together meant that she started talking about it. And I think that, yeah, there's something that we can really learn from, like how we can tell these stories in different ways, I suppose. And when you're spending a year following a group of people and seeing how they like change, and how their story and like their relationship to that story changes over a year is a really cool experiment and a really cool thing to be able to listen to. Like, they let you into so much of their lives. And yeah, it's really beautiful. I think that there's a lot we can learn about it in terms of journalism storytelling as well. Like it's a real act of journalism, and while still being a collaboration. And I think that, that's something we should pay attention to. And it's also just like, an incredible story. So have a listen to that one. I'm going to have a drink because I've been talking for 20 minutes solid. It's pretty weird. Also, if you have questions at any point in time, like, put them in the comments, because I can weirdly see them here, which this is my first ever live stream. I didn't know that was possible. So if you want to write anything, I can see it. The last comment is Olivia say, not the penis out, I'm leaving. So if you want to bump that up so that the last comments, so the people who are also commenting don't think that this is a stream about an owl statue that also looks like a penis in Canberra, Australia, then that would be great. I'm going to have another sip of coffee. I'm going to try, this is in my party room mug. The Party Room's a great podcast from the ABC about Australian politics, so maybe only listen if you're Australian, or it'll seem really confusing and weird. But all right, next podcast. So the next podcast I'm going to talk about is called Pill Pop. And it's a show from, it came out of, actually, I'm not sure if this is where it came out of, but the way I heard about it is it was part of the Wheeler Centre's Signal Boost program. So people submit their ideas for a podcast, and the fact that I'm reading Martin's comments that he's loving the non-owl material. Thank you, Martin. That's what we're here for, is the non-penis owl material. So that's good. And so I need to change the slide. It's just still looking like there we are, Pill Pop. So this podcast I became aware of it from Signal Boost. So Signal Boost is the Wheeler Centre's podcast incubator, I suppose, and they are open for ideas at the moment, actually. So if you're an Australian to Olivia Seconds Bird's Eye View, so thanks, Olivia, that's good. It's a really good podcast. And if anyone has podcasts, Australian podcasts that I haven't listed here too, maybe chuck them in the comments at the end so that I can share some of them, and maybe like a sentence on why they're awesome or what technique you've learned from them, because that's I think useful for other makers to hear as well. So they're open at the moment. The Wheeler Centre's Signal Boost, a new round of it. So you can send in your ideas on the theme public is the theme this year. So this came from last year's, I became aware of this podcast from the year before Signal Boost, so the last intake. And Sylvie and Izzy both have chronic illness. And so they have started this podcast where they speak to people who also have chronic illness and talk about their lives, about about like what that's like, how it affects their lives, and then also just about them as people, their careers and their what they're into. Their journey to get diagnosis is something that comes up a lot, like sort of different issues in the medical system. But it's also it's really fun. Like, it's a really fun show. And I think that probably coming at that, saying it's a show about chronic illness, but it's really, really fun. Like, that's something that you kind of need to tell people up top. And the way that they've done that just makes me so happy. And it's something that I've actually been thinking about so much because they place the podcast in a fictional ambulance, and it really works. So they create kind of this sound for within the ambulance. The ambulance is called Ambulance Armstrong, and it helps that Sylvie and Izzy are both really fun and funny and have a great chemistry together. But the premise of the show is that they're traveling together in this ambulance and visiting other people that they're going to speak to. And so it kind of turns their interview show into a road trip. And there's all sorts of fun that they have with that. Like, there's a defibrillator that they're sort of knocking over, and, they're wondering, they're driving through different places and going down side streets. And so there's fun that they can have to sort of play with the intros and play with how they're living in this space, living in this ambulance that they got off Gumtree. But there's also there's like sound. There's sound that they can play with. There's story that they can play with. But it also just means that every podcast, the start of every podcast, no matter how heavy the like fictional, the non-fictional content, the interview content might get, the podcast still seems light and fun, and they kind of introduce, like, they're happy to joke about different things that maybe people listening might not know if they're like up for jokes about as well. So I think that it's been making me think a lot about what space, like where is my podcast taking place? Where is this podcast living? Like, is there room to give it a virtual world that the intros happen in? If we're going to be using sound effects, if we're going to be using sound in this sort of show that traditionally might not have that much sound, like, can we do it within a fictional space and make it seem like, give it kind of a wallpaper that feels consistent, or give it its own, like, what is the fictional ambulance for this show is something that I keep thinking. And it's all because of Pill Pop and their fictional Gumtree ambulance. So Olivia's written a non-fiction show in a fictional setting, and that's like a very clear way of saying what I'm trying to get across. So thank you, Olivia. It's it's really a cool idea. And I think give it a listen anyway, because it is a really fun podcast. And there's lots of incredible information in there as well. Like the first episode about endometriosis taught me heaps. And yeah, you kind of learn about a different illness or something different every time. So give that one a listen. All right, I'm going to change slides. So the next one I'm going to talk about is Slaughterhouse Road. So this one is a podcast musical, which I really love. And I think I'd love this no matter what, because I really like a podcast musical. So it's by producer Jess Hamilton, her sister Annie Hamilton, who plays Tammy, and a guy named Mark Harding, who plays Jimmy, and they're kind of the main characters. There's a bigger cast than that, but that's the main players are Tammy and Jimmy, and it's kind of a romance between them. It's a horror romance Australiana. I forget how they write it. They write it quite succinctly, but it's basically, it's got horror, it's got romance, it's got Australiana. It's a musical, and it's 3 episodes, and I still find myself, I'll be washing the dishes and singing this song under my breath, or singing multiple songs from this podcast under my breath. That's really good music. It's kind of alt country music, most of them, and basically it takes place in a small town on the coast of Australia. If you're not from Australia, it's probably an interesting intro to Australian audio. I think it's it kind of plays into different tropes of Australian stories and Australian Australiana in an interesting way. Probably a more interesting way, maybe, even if you're not familiar with them. You might be like, wow, this is what they're all like. But it really made me, what it's made me think about as a maker is playing with multiple genres. So I think it could have been easy to go really hard in either direction on this one. You could have gone really hard on the rom-com kind of angle of Tammy, who's a honey seller. She's got a honey stall and she's selling honey for her mum in this small town, and she dreams of getting out and making the big time as a singer. And Jimmy, who's kind of a good-for-nothing surfer who doesn't want to work and just wants to surf all the time. You could really lean into the romance, and then you have a romance Australiana musical. Or you could go really hard the other way into the horror of it all, which is Jimmy works at an abattoir, and yeah, to quote the song, it's pretty grim when you find out what happens to him. So I think they could have lent really into that as well, but they blend those things in a really fun way, and it means that it's it's not a podcast that you're listening to for the tropes. It's something you're listening to really be entertained, because all of that in there mixed up together makes it really fun and silly, and also kind of the whole point of it. The whole point of it is kind of fun and silly. So I think that by mixing those genres and playing with the tropes of all of them, the Australiana, the horror, and the musical, and the rom-com, kind of makes it really cool. So listen to Slaughterhouse Road. It's a very clever podcast, and it's a good one. So the next one I'm going to talk about is an episode of RN Fictions, which is the ABC's fiction show. Actually, I need to change. So I work for this show, but I had nothing to do with this series. So that's why I can recommend it to you all without feeling like an idiot. But I, so it's called Oz Gothic, the series that I want to talk about. Camilla Hannon produced that series, and Sophie Townsend was the series producer. And each episode had a different writer. And the episode I want to talk about now is by Maria Tamarkin, who's a really great experimental nonfiction writer. So it's kind of not straight fiction, even though it's on RN Fictions. It's playing with ideas around women walking home alone and feeling safe walking alone at night, which is a big issue everywhere. I think in Melbourne in particular, I have found, which is where I think Maria is. It's definitely where Camilla is. It yeah, I think it's maybe when I lived in Melbourne, I found it was more of a conversation there because of certain murders that have happened in the past 5-10 years. So it's playing with the different ideas around women's safety at night and women's safety alone on the street between generations and between different people and different perspectives. And the thing that I've been thinking a lot about, and I wanted to talk about it today because I really want people to I would love people's recommendations of anything that kind of fits this bill. But it has been making me think about what the audio version of, I guess, the essay is, or I think a lot of books that I've read in the last few years that are sort of my favorite are books of essays that kind of blend reporting and personal stories and books like Maria's, which are kind of creative nonfiction and really fragmented and draw together different things. And I think that the form that matches that isn't quite like what we think of as a narrative, a podcast narrative or an audio narrative. It's something else, and something else that sounds more like this episode, which is called Moving Sitting Ducks. It kind of takes different voices and different ideas, and some of them are written and some of them are interviews, and turns all of those fragments into something that's really beautiful to listen to and evokes feeling as well. It uses those different fragments to evoke the feeling of walking home or the feeling of having a different opinion to your mum on something. And that's what I really love about it. It uses interviews with Maria's daughter, and also she also performed some of the music in it. She's an opera singer, and so some of the music that you get and some of the sounds are her daughter Billy performing, which I think adds something to it, makes it really like haunting and beautiful and wonderful to listen to. And then also other young women. So it's kind of the disconnect between Maria's feelings on it and other young women. Another technique that they use that is really cool, and I would, never think to do, is they kind of have these interludes where it's I think they call it an intermission, but it's a moment in the middle where it feels like at the time like it's unrelated to the rest of the podcast. They have this breathing exercise, and you kind of, the first time you hear this story, you might be like, oh, I'm going to do this. What a cool idea. It's a nifty interlude in the middle of the podcast. But it kind of comes back and is related to the story and is all tied in. And I think that's really clever to think about how you can use different fragments and use different things and weave them into the story in a way that feels organic and also really satisfying for the listener when you've participated in their breathing exercise and then you realize that you're part of the story. What they've gotten you to do is actually related to what you're listening to, which was really cool. A really cool technique. The sound is also just beautiful, as with anything Camilla makes, but it and the writing, like anything Maria Tamarkin writes. So yeah, it's a great story, and I think I would love everyone to think about how it's put together and then try and do more stuff like that, because I really like listening to it, which is the whole point of talking about it here, is more like that, please. Martin's written in the comments, like interested in essayists in podcast. He's also interested in essayists in podcasting right now. I love John Green's Anthropocene Reviewed, which is pure essayism, which I really love that show too. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's there's something about combining different different thoughts and different threads of thought and then tying them in a way that feels really satisfying for the reader. So you feel like you've learned something, but you're also like feeling something in a different way, which I love I love reading that, and I would love to be listening to that more. But I think it is something that I don't know how I'm going to go about applying that in my own work yet. I don't know how I create that. So that's something that's like a creative challenge that I want to throw out there so that other people can do it first and then I can copy them, but not really. But also a little bit. All right. Where is my screen? Oh, up here. Okay, so this one falls outside the last year, which is what I was going to confine myself to. But this came out sort of the start of last year. Oh, Olivia's got one. Jill Lepore's new show is also a little bit SAE. Oh, I don't know that show. Olivia, can you put the name of whatever that podcast is in the comments? Because that sounds like something that I really want to listen to. That would be really great. And then I will share it with everyone. I mean, you can all see the comments, so you can just go listen to it when Olivia puts it in there as well. But yeah, I want to know. So this one is another Radio New Zealand podcast. It's one of my favorite things that I've listened to in the last little while. Chris has said that Jill Lepore's show makes so many weird choices, and I like it. Is it called? Oh, The Last Archive. Okay, Olivia's put it up. It's called The Last Archive, and I'm really excited to listen to that. That sounds really cool. It comes recommended by Olivia and Chris, so it must be a really good show. I'm excited to listen to that. So the worst sitcom ever made is an interrogation by Jeff, the host, of his biggest failure, which was a really public failure, in that he was the writer and I suppose showrunner of what has gone down in New Zealand history as the worst sitcom ever made. And I was not, I'm in Australia. I wasn't aware of this sitcom at all. It sounds like everyone in New Zealand who was around at the time was, but it was called Melody Rules, and it's legendary in sort of how bad it was. And this guy was responsible for it, and people credit it with ruining their careers, with the reason that they left New Zealand was because they were part of the show. So it's sort of like this spectacular failure that he's dissecting. And what's really fun to listen, it's really fun to listen to it because he's not he is self-deprecating in that he knows that this show was terrible, but he doesn't go over the top with that. I don't think he's not like, oh, poor me. He's sort of, it's far enough away that he has some distance so he can shit on himself, but also really, I guess tell the story in a way that doesn't make you pity him too much, that it's uncomfortable. And the way he sort of delves into his own past is really funny and interesting. And it's been making me think about when these stories work. So it is really similar, I think, to Dead Eyes, which is has recently come out, which is an American podcast looking at why someone was fired from a Tom Hanks miniseries in the 90s. And the common thread both of them are interrogating failures from their own acting lives or comedy, not acting, but comedy performance lives. And I think that something that makes these podcasts work maybe is that their guests are funny and engaging. And it's a lot of it relies on how into these people you are and how engagingly they tell the story, and how it's the same thing. They're self-deprecating, but they're not like, woe is me, this was terrible and my life's still ruined. They're coming at it with a healthy perspective and a distance that means they can make fun of it. And also we know that if you were to interrogate the failures from my life in a podcast, I don't think it would be that interesting. And I think it's because the people in these stories are a little bit famous and it was a public failure. It's almost like it's almost like reality TV or something. You're dissecting something that's a little bit glamorous in a way when you're dissecting showbiz failure. So I'm not sure what the normal person equivalent of something like Worst Sitcom Ever Made or Dead Eyes would be. But in this form, I think it really works, taking something that happened to these people and then having them act as investigator to try and pull it apart. I really enjoy listening to it. I think the interviews that they do work on two different levels because on one level, they're just trying to get the information. They want that like narrative tape for their podcast, and they want to be putting it together into a story that makes sense. But on another level, they're kind of, it's like therapy for them, because they're either talking about their own psyche with people that they know, or they're talking about something that happened to them, or creative choices that they made a long time ago. And so that's cool as well, like listening to someone get often really harsh feedback from people that they impacted on tape is just good tape, and kind of works in all sorts of different ways. So yeah, I really like this podcast. It also, just as a creative, I think that it's one that it's one I'd recommend. It kind of has a lot in there about the different levels of decision making in creative projects, and I think that that's another reason that podcasters in particular quite like this podcast, is that there is this interrogation in the podcast of who is making creative decisions and why they're making them. So there's an episode about the network, and the network making all these decisions, but there's also there's a bit of a talent quest search for writers on this show, which is a bit of a form of I'm going to throw Mike Williams under the bus. What Mike Williams calls Australian Idol programming, which I've now adopted that term and like use it all the time. Oh, it doesn't translate. Oh yeah, it does. Like American Idol. Yeah, it's fine. But where you're kind of running a bit of like a talent quest to find the best show, and everyone puts in that effort kind of at the front end, and gives you all their ideas, and then you maybe pick the best one, and then it gets made. And often the best one, or in this case the best writers, like there's different reasons for why they're chosen, and maybe they're not always transparent about what those reasons are. And I think in this context, it's trying to create New Zealand's first ever sitcom, and which maybe is a strange objective in that sort of process anyway. But I think that as podcasters, that's something that we experience a lot, is that sort of Australian Idol programming in the past few years. So yeah, that's another reason why I think that podcasters in particular might enjoy this show, is sort of the interrogation of when that works and when it doesn't work, and why it might not work, and all the different competing interests at play when something like that happens. Yeah, give it a listen. The worst sitcom ever made. I think they, like Radio New Zealand, are putting out some really cool stuff. There's another podcast called White Silence, which I really like. Oh, Mike's just popped up in the comments saying, true. Damn, I hoped you weren't you weren't listening when I was like, Mike shits on this sort of programming all the time, but he is. Hi, Mike. Good term. Thank you for letting me steal it whenever I talk about this sort of stuff ever. But I always credit it to you. So I'm going to go to the next one now. So the next podcast I want to talk to you guys about is called Little Yarns. So this is an ABC podcast, and I think it's really well done. So it's for kids, so it's a co-listening podcast for preschoolers, which means that it's designed for preschoolers and their parents, or their teachers, their educators, to listen with them. So it's interactive in a way, like it asks kids to say things out loud. Like you can imagine playing it through a speaker and having 5 kids sit around and engage with the show. And yeah, it takes different First Nations places and languages and takes you onto country to learn about that place, and also learn about the stories there, or about the words that that are used to refer to different things about place in those places, and also about family and things like that. So words that kids would be using or remember. So words like mother and yeah, also words about place. So shore and beach and spider and different animal words. And like, I really find this podcast, I'm an adult and I don't have kids, but I find it really great to listen to. Like, I don't know any Indigenous words, and and this podcast kind of teaches you one or two an episode, and teaches you specifically the place that they're used and the country that they're related to, and the different thinking behind, you know, sometimes there might be a word for fire, and you kind of talk about what it means for people on the Tiwi Islands to sit around a fire together at night. And you know, the people who are talking to the host, Rudy Bremer, in the podcast, also just like, I think when people are talking to kids, sometimes they tell stories and speak in ways that they, or maybe are more vulnerable or something, in a way that they might not be in a show for adults. And so I find it's a really gentle show. And the stories that people are telling are kind of like, really personal and beautiful, and often about when they were a kid, or how they spent their time when they were young. So yeah, it's a really great one to listen to, even if you're not co-listening with preschoolers. But the reason I wanted to talk about it here, the technique I think I wanted to share and to think about, is the use of, they have a really beautiful use of soundscape in this program, and each episode is specific to a place, and it does really evoke the sounds of that place, and sort of the specific soundscape they build for each episode is related to the country that they're visiting, and the sounds that they're going to be talking about. So beach in Tiwi is, you know, all sounds of the beach, and things like that. So yeah, I think it's a really sort of soothing, delicate use of sound in this show. And then personally, I also really like the moment where somehow Rudy's always the last one to try out the word, and then the person who is the guest says, like, "Well done." And I always get a laugh out of that, because I think that it often, there's lots of kids trying out these different words, and often it sounds like the guest is congratulating Rudy on how well she pronounced whatever word you're learning, and that makes me smile. So give this one a listen. I think it's really clever. There's a really smart team behind it: Rudy Bremer, Samia Bella, and Emma Gibbs. And yeah, it's just like a really well-made kids program that, yeah, adults can meditate to, I suppose. Oh wow, we're kind of getting to the end of the hour, but I'm going to read some comments and see. I think people have been putting more essay shows in here. Oh, no, it's not more essay shows. Martin says that he's been canning Deadeyes, and this is not something that Australians say. Canning maybe means like shitting on here, but he says canning like listening lots to it. So there we are. It's like it's like when I said nut out the narrative in Martin will explain canning another time, but I said nut out the narrative in some sort of in a podcast Facebook group the other day, and realized that that's not something that anyone in outside of Australia says, to nut something out. And now I'm thinking it's like, is it about gum nuts, or maybe it's not, but to nut something out is to like work something out. Anyway, we really need to be careful, because I also thought the man was saying that he did not like Deadeyes, but he's saying that he's been listening to a lot of it, as have I. All right, I'm going to go to the next one. All right, so people movers. This was, I had to like shift things up yesterday. Yesterday? Yeah, no, Friday, because there was a new episode of People Movers came out, and it's a last episode, so the end of this podcast, and it's it's really clever, really good, and it made me think of, so People Movers is a podcast about escalators by Lindsay Green, and it's a really good podcast about escalators, and there's more to escalators than you might think. So if you haven't listened to this one already, then give it a go. But it's over now, so you can't listen along as they come out, because there's no more, which is really sad. But it made me think of two things. Like, I'm going to talk about two techniques, but first of all is how to say goodbye to a podcast. And this is something I've thought about a bit over the last few years. I think some podcasts have done it really well, and there's like an art to saying goodbye to something that that is hard to pull off, but when you do it well, you do it well. I think the ones that I enjoy the most are the ones that lean into the earnestness of saying goodbye, like the ones who take themselves seriously and are like, this podcast matters, and I'm going to send it out in a way that it deserves, I suppose, which is what Lindsay did. I think that her last episode really pays tribute to the silliness, but also the earnestness, and the what she was making was like had meaning. And I think that it pays tribute to both those things at the same time, which a good ending should do. And I think it should also leave the listener like someone who's been spending time with you and putting time into listening to your podcast. It should leave them with a sense of closure or satisfaction or something. And I think that she does that really well. And I think there's something really honorable in ending a podcast, ending a project, instead of pod fading away and maybe being like, oh, come back to it sometimes and chuck things in. You could do that, but it's nice to give people the satisfaction of ending and then be like, surprise, you got more, instead of just petering out that way. I think it feels good. I'm trying to think of, there were some other podcasts that ended really well that I was going to mention, but I didn't write them down, and now I'm on a live stream, so my brain doesn't work. But there's an art to it, and I think that Lindsay nailed it. But so what she does for this final episode is interview herself, and she's treated half the audio so that it sounds genuinely like she's being interviewed, which I think would be really hard to achieve as a producer, to make it sound. I was talking to someone about it, and we're talking about I was talking to like my team at Audiocraft about it, and Selena Shannon was mentioning that like in film, it's like the eye lines are off. Like if you're trying to like pretend to talk to yourself, if you're like Lindsay Lohan in The Parent Trap and you're acting with yourself, and like the trick is to try and get the eye lines right, which I don't know, I'm never going to work in visuals, so I never have to worry about that, thank God. But I think that Lindsay does whatever the audio equivalent of getting the eye lines right is. Like she reacts well to whatever's asked of her, sometimes in a really funny way and sometimes in like a really straight way. And I think that works really well. I found myself forgetting that it was Lindsay talking to Lindsay. Like she'd ask something, I'd be like, oh, what an inappropriate question or whatever. I'd be like, oh, Lindsay has to answer that now. And then I'd be like, oh no, it's her, it's fine. And so that's the first thing that it made me think of. And the second thing it made me think of is something that she says in that episode, in that podcast, is that she was able to use to create a character on the podcast that was shy, and that was like, if she's that into escalators, she could play to her own strengths and her own personality and create a character who was really into escalators and was a little bit shy. And, all those things are true about her, but she really leaned into those things to create the character that she was playing on the podcast. And so it made me think about how I can use that in my own podcast making and my own audio stories. And when I'm working with people, like, how do we create because it's very easy to think like, I'll just be myself on the podcast, but you're never your whole self on a podcast. You're always like elements of yourself. And I think that sometimes my instinct is to play to the elements of myself that aren't my strengths and try and like put it on or something. But what would it sound like to create a podcast sound or create a podcast persona that played to my strengths and the way that I interact with people and the way I'm comfortable sort of moving through the world. And I think that that's something that Lindsay did really well in one of the first episodes. I remember she's like, I hate calling people up, so I email them or something. I hate talking to strangers. And she kind of goes to she goes somewhere to vox pop people and then can't bring herself to do it, or, and they're just things that like I do too. And I've never said that in a podcast, but I loved it when she said it in hers. So I think that sometimes being, creating a character that plays to your strengths is maybe something that you can think about applying in your own podcast. Wow, there's a lot of comments here about what the word canning means. And not all of them are appropriate to read out. Some of them are rude. But I don't know how much of this is true and how much of it is fake news shared by Mike Williams. So I'm not going to read any out just in case I'm spreading fake news. But if you're really interested, you can read the comments. And we're almost over. I guess if anyone has any questions about any of these things, then please put them in the comments. But otherwise, we're going to wrap up really soon. And the last piece of audio I want to talk about is not an Australian podcast, but it's an Australian producer. So that's why I want to mention it. And I have been thinking about it a lot. And it's the episode of Field Recordings that Camilla Hannon recorded. It's kind of a longer, it's a longer piece, a longer field recording. Oh, I need to change the slide. Here we are. It's a longer field recording where she's in a gully in kind of bushland, and there's lots of different forest sounds, and it's really beautiful, and I listen to it a lot to chill out. And then at some point, like a kookaburra starts cackling, a bird starts singing, but it's quite far into the audio, and it's a really memorable moment for me. It's like one of the most memorable moments in in Australian podcasts in the last little while, because it's really satisfying. And I think that like listening to it, that moment where it's quite a similar soundscape and it is really soothing, and you kind of forget that you're listening to it and just relax a little bit. And then when that like bird interjects and starts singing, it feels really good. And I think that it sounds like perseverance. Like it sounds like Camilla's sat there for a really long time and just waited for nature to kind of give her something, and then it does. And it's really wonderful to listen to. I really love it. So yeah, I think that give that one a listen. It's the first episode of Field Recordings. I think it's way back at the start, but yeah, I really love that moment. And I think that the technique that I take away from it is that like if you sit there long enough, then something will happen, and you don't, if you sit in an interesting sounding place long enough, like the world is going to create cool tape for you, which I think is the lesson of all of Field Recordings. All of this podcast is that like if you turn your tape on the world, then cool stuff will happen. And yeah, just like take the time to record it. So wow, I just talked for a straight hour. I'm going to see if my coffee's still warm. Nope, it's really cold. It's cold coffee now. But thanks heaps for joining us. It's been really fun to spend Sunday morning with you guys. And thanks for your comments of SA-ish podcasts and SA-ish podcast episodes, which maybe is like a more achievable thing to aim for. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. How do I do that? There we are. Yeah, if you think of any others, please tweet them at me, because I really want to listen to them. I'm going to listen to the ones that you guys have recommended. And if you think of any more, Mike has a question. What does Australian podcasting need more of? I think I want more surprises, not from you, Mike Williams. You're surprising enough. But I would like to be listening to something and really be surprised, I think. Imaginary advice. Martin's just suggested imaginary advice is an essay. That's peak example of an essay podcast. And I love that podcast. That's a really good example. But yeah, I think like that's what I'm really looking for at the moment, is like to be surprised by audio. And I really like it when, and that's such a hard thing to action, to be like, I'm making audio that'll surprise Jess specifically. I mean, things surprise other people at different points, I'm sure. But that's the thing that, I want like a moment, and it's usually only like one moment in a story or something that that really like shocks me or surprises me. And so that's what I'm listening a lot for, I think. Helen asks, there are so many extraordinary automakers in Australia, and it boils my piss that the pod lists of the Northern Hemisphere forget about this nearly all the time. Oh, that's a statement. I'm going to take that as a statement, Helen. But yeah, I think that there's heaps here, and And there's more and more coming out all the time. Like since I started programming Audiocraft 3 years ago now, this is my third festival programming it, and it is really like there's more and more every year, and quality stuff, like really good stuff. And I certainly really like listening to it. And yeah, I mean, I hope you guys do too. There's stuff happening in Australia. Is there a homegrown pod press in Australia that can promote the hell out of shows? There are people promoting shows pretty regularly. So, yeah, I guess. So Eric George at The Australian does a weekly column. The Big Issue does a podcast column. They come out every month. So that's probably and Peter Wells at 9 at Fairfax does podcast reviews. So I think there is like a little bit of a culture of sharing podcast shows. I think that Passive Vulpes, so Aaron and Lee in Melbourne do a really good job sort of promoting and like signal boosting the new fiction shows. So Lee keeps Lee Davis Thalborn keeps like a Podchaser list of all the new Australian fiction shows that I find really valuable. I'll go there to check and see if there's any new fiction that I haven't heard yet, which is really useful. But yeah, I do find it hard to surface Australia, like often, and it's my job to listen to as many Australian podcasts as I can, but surfacing them is still really hard even for me. Like there'll be shows that I like someone will post in a Facebook group being like, our show just won this award. And I'll be like, what is that show? And then I'll go look at it and I'll be like, oh, wow, there's heaps of listeners. And like, it's a really engaged community. And so there are these different podcast neighborhoods, like to refer to that awesome diagram that came out, chart that came out a couple of weeks ago about kind of in our own podcast rabbit holes sometimes. And Helen said we need to get our own Caroline Crampton. I totally think we do. It's like, how do you find those really good shows, and how do you? For us, it's just different Facebook groups and talking to each other, and you hope that you get referred to the really good ones. But it doesn't always happen. There'll be shows that have been sitting there for a year that I haven't come across at all, and it'd be great to have more of a culture of listening to them. I think the main way I find them is the creator will tell me about them still. So please tweet your shows at me or send them to me. And the EOI for the festival is also, I get a big influx of new shows to listen to every year at that time, which is really good. I mean, I'm not a podcast critic, I'm a podcast maker, and I go on all sorts of radio segments to recommend podcasts to people because there isn't a culture of people who surface shows as like a career or as something that they isn't sort of people who are podcast critics as much here, I suppose. But yeah, need to get those Ozpods into Northern Hemisphere ears. I mean, it's not my duty, but I kind of like doing it anyway. How is it organizing Audiocraft to be online this year? It's actually been surprisingly fun. Like once I got over the disappointment of not having everyone in the same room together, it's a year today since we were all together last year. So that's, it's a year since opening night. Since you all went to opening night while I bumped in. But yeah, once I got over the sadness of not seeing everyone in person, the excitement and the creative challenge of programming something that works online is actually really fun. There's a podcast from the New York Times called Together Apart. And in their first episode, I was kind of being a bit miserable about it. And then I listened to their first episode. This was a couple of months ago now. And it's about having meaningful gatherings online. And it said that it was all about how you need to start with your purpose. And if you're designing a good online gathering, you have to start with your purpose and then try and think what is the structure that gives form to your purpose. Instead of taking your offline structure and plonking it online, you've got to go back to your purpose and think, what's the structure that gives form to that? And then it became really easy because I was like, our purpose, we're really clear about our purpose. And so I was able to go back to that and be like, what's the structure that'll give form to Audiocraft's purpose online. And ever since I went back to basics and went back to that, I think it like opened up really fun stuff for me. 'Cause there's stuff that we can't do at a normal festival that we're going to be able to do at this one. So, and I've also been able to hit up like people all around the world who might not be able to travel to Australia for a podcast festival. And I hope that the audience kind of is the same, that there's people, I mean, there's been podcast meetups cancelled in India that I know of, but also sort of all around the world. So I hope that people will be able to join in and come whenever the time zones allow. I've been having a real struggle around how I do this in the opposite way, because there are things I would fly to that are being cancelled. I'm like, do I sleep? Like, do I take the Friday and the Monday off and then just pretend I'm on a plane and have big naps so that I can start flipping my day so that I'm awake in your day and awake in your and asleep at your night or something, because I really want to be going to more stuff that that is online for, you know, I don't think things will be this online forever. So I want to take advantage of it while they are. And yeah, there's stuff that I'm excited to do at the festival. Some of it won't work because like we can't test it. It's really hard to test it. So some of it's going to be really weird and you guys are just going to have to, that's the same as an in-person festival. But we'll try it and see how it goes. And the stuff that's really good, maybe we can find ways to keep doing that online and never talk about the weird stuff again, I think. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining me this morning / this evening / this afternoon. It's been really nice spending time with you all, and yeah, please get in touch with your essay stories, with your favorite Australian podcasts. Maybe just leave them in the comments anyway. Like, I think that I've definitely watched a lot of these streams back because I'm not awake at 7 a.m. on a Sunday. So I think that, yeah, if there's ways to still leave comments after a stream's gone, maybe there's not. But if there is, like, please leave more Australian podcasts. As Martin says in the comments, on Wednesday we have Christina Moore talking about monetization, and next Saturday will be, I don't want to mispronounce this person's name, Jalika Tentigua Williams will be talking about how to test your podcast. Oh my God, I want to watch that, testing your podcast. Yeah, that's a great topic. And yeah, thanks so much for having me, Martin, and Podcast Maker Weekend. I think that yeah, it's been really fun, and it's been fun watching everyone else's live streams as well. So thanks heaps for having me. Bye. I'm gonna keep waving.